Hi, I'm Kaylin, and I'm the diagnostician for borderline personality disorder. And before we really get into the specifics of borderline, I kind of wanted to give a background of general personality disorders in the DSM-5. So we're going to start on slide 2, where it has the DSM-5 criteria for general personality disorders. So first of all, it's a inflexible pattern of inner experience that's distinct from cultural expectations and influences at least two of either cognition about the self and others, which is basically how you think about how yourself and others think and behave. Affect is your emotional response to things. Interpersonal functioning, your close relationships with other people, and impulse control. And then this pattern of inner experience and behavior has to cause significant distress or impairment, is inflexible, and pervasive across all situations. It can't just be in one situation. And it's usually onset by early adulthood, and it's persistent, meaning it lasts a long, long time. It's usually considered to be a lifelong condition, and it's not explained by a different mental disorder, a substance, or medical condition. Compared to the DSM-4, this diagnostic criteria is exactly the same. The only difference is that the DSM-5 decided to get away from the multi-axial system, and it has a different approach to diagnosing personality disorders in section 3 of the DSM-5, but it's not official, but we'll get into that later. So on slide 3, it just says that this version is a categorical model. It separates them into categories, and there's 10 personality disorders that are broken up into 3 clusters. So cluster A is the odd eccentric, cluster B is the unpredictable, the basically dramatic erratic, and then cluster 3 is the anxious fearful. Borderline falls under cluster B, which we will get into on slide 4. On slide 4, borderline personality disorder, it was introduced in the DSM-3, and the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-4 and the 5 are exactly the same. This is because a lot of people wanted to change the way that personality disorders were diagnosed, but they were unsure when would be an appropriate time to do that. This is because a lot of personality disorders haven't received the attention or the amount of research that's really necessary to implement this across the board. So they decided to keep the diagnostic criteria the same, and they've just added on in the 3rd section of the DSM, which is basically the section that needs further research, a different approach to diagnosing. So in the DSM-5, section 2, which is actually the diagnostic, approved version to use, we will get into how they diagnose borderline personality disorder. So on slide 5, we have the diagnostic explanations of what's required to be diagnosed with borderline. And you have to have at least 5 of the following characteristics, and the first one is frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Individuals with borderline personality disorder have a fear of being left behind or abandoned, and this obviously impacts how they interpret their relationships with other people, which goes into the second one, which is a pattern of unstable and intense relationships with other people. Basically, they go through this cycle of idealizing and devaluating the people that are close to them. So it's basically a love-hate relationship with that person. And then this obviously could push people away, which kind of then feeds into that fear of abandonment. And then the next one is identity disturbance, which is basically unstable self-image. This can kind of go into the idea of splitting, which is when your beliefs kind of get split into 2 categories. So it's black and white thinking. They don't have a middle ground. So for themselves, they'll either see themselves at the moment good or bad. There is no in between. And this basically goes towards anything, but especially themselves. And then another one is impulsivity. And if this is one of the diagnostic criteria that they meet, they have to have it in at least 2 different areas of their lives. And it has to be somewhat self-damaging. So this would include spending, their sexual habits, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. And then the next one is suicidal behaviors or self-manipulating behaviors. This can't be included in their impulsivity. I mean, their impulsiveness could feed into that and make it worse, but that's an entirely separate diagnostic criteria. Affect instability due to basically a quick change in mood. They change their moods constantly. It's not every day, it's more like multiple times per day, and it's sudden. Chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate anger, so they get angry really fast, a lot of times over small things, and transient stress. So this is basically saying that whenever they're under a lot of stress, they tend to dissociate. This dissociation could play into the fact that a lot of individuals with borderline have suffered previous trauma in their life. So this could be due to that trauma. There's not really quite enough research yet, but hopefully in the next DSM they'll have more information. So on slide 6, we go into the problems of diagnosing borderline, as well as just personality disorders in general. So in general, the DSM-5, it says that the general criteria to be diagnosed is that it's a persistent disorder, meaning that it's going to be present no matter what, but the research has shown that about 50% of those diagnosed with personality disorder see that this isn't the case. A lot of their symptoms go away or are a lot better within 2 years. And then 99% of this group sees that within 16 years. As for another thing is that a lot of individuals with personality disorders have overlapping symptoms with other personality disorders, as well as other disorders of different categories, such as mood disorders. For borderline personality disorder, a lot of overlaps are seen with mood disorders like depression and bipolar. And so 50% of these people could fall under a different diagnosis. So as for gender, I have gender on there because 75% of people diagnosed with borderline are actually female, but a lot of people believe that gender-wise, they are just as likely to have it. It's just that men are more likely to be diagnosed with depression or bipolar. And another reason it's difficult is because of the categorical rather than dimensional approach, meaning it's either you have it or you don't. There's no varying levels of extremity. On to slide 7, we go into the alternative diagnostic model that's seen in section 3 of the DSM-5. This is basically the dimensional approach to diagnosing personality disorders, and it has 2 different criteria, A and B. A is personality functioning, so that includes your identity. Your identity is basically the awareness of yourself, your emotions, and your boundaries. Self-direction is your ability to set goals and reach them for yourself. Empathy is your ability to understand how other people feel and think. And intimacy is the ability to form and keep personal relationships. Criteria B, it falls under the 5-factor model, and it goes into personality traits. The ones that are considered are negative affectivity, which is basically your emotions, like if you're pessimistic. Detachment is not having very many close relationships. Antagonism is having not getting along better with other people. Disinhibition and psychoticism. And then these 5 personality traits are separated into smaller personality trait facets that kind of describe them. We'll get into this more on the next slide, slide 8, where I give specifics for borderline. Borderline personality disorder, criteria A, it has to have a moderate or greater impairment in personality functioning, and it has to have 2 examples of this impairment in at least 4 of the categories. So, for example, you could have impairment in your identity, self-direction, empathy, and intimacy, but you have to have at least 2 of those areas. So, for example, identity would encompass an unstable self-image, emptiness, and dissociative states. Self-direction would be instability in following plans. Empathy is you're less likely to be able to understand how other people feel. Intimacy goes back to the idealization, devaluation of other people that you have in your personal life. Criteria B is you have to have at least 4 of the traits out of the 7, and it has to include either impulsivity, risk-taking, or hostility. Some examples of this one would be emotional liability would be your frequent mood changes, anxiousness, separation and insecurity would be that abandonment fear, depressivity would be your hopelessness, suicidal ideation, impulsivity would be difficulty following plans, risk-taking is your involvement in dangerous activities, and hostility would be anger and easily being irritated. And then some of the differences between the diagnostic criteria seen in Section 2 and Section 3 of the DSM-5 would be that in the DSM Section 2, the categorical model has no varying levels of severity, while the dimensional one does. It ranges from no impairment to extreme impairment. The categorical must reach at least 5 criteria, while the dimensional requires 6 or more. Categorical has no specific criteria needed. Meanwhile, the dimensional requires that you either have impulsivity, risk-taking, or hostility. And then the categorical model is the official diagnostic model. This is what psychiatrists and psychologists are expected to follow. And the dimensional is just a preview into what could possibly be the new diagnostic approach in the future. But both of them have the same symptoms, they're just separated differently. So some risk factors of borderline personality disorder. Obviously, your environment. If you grew up in an abusive or neglectful household, you're 7 times more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder later on in life. Another thing is emotional dysregulation and invalidation. If you grew up in a household where your family didn't listen to how you felt or put you down constantly, you're more likely to be diagnosed with it. Brain structure, you have diminished connectivity in your brain between the amygdala, the hippocampus, the orbitofrontal cortex. Obviously, these structures are very important in emotion, behavior, and decision-making. And beyond this, heritability, there's a 67% chance that you can inherit this. And then another risk, not related to being diagnosed with it, but a risk of having it, is that there's a 60 to 70% chance of these individuals diagnosed with borderline personality disorder to attempt suicide. And then here are my sources.